If you're able to, try to think back to 2022. Ignore all those memories about the pandemic and COVID and all that, and think back to the World Cup. And not the soccer or football part of it, the Qatar part of it. The controversy about how Qatar not only bribed their way in order to host the FIFA World Cup, but that Qatar built the infrastructure and the arena for the World Cup off the back of what many people consider a form of slavery. This, in combination with stories of Muslims having hereditary servants back in their hometowns in the Middle East, it just got me thinking, do Muslim countries still practice slavery? I know they technically, usually legally ban it, but do they just ignore the enforcing part of it or find some sort of loophole? Maybe I'm just being skeptical. Hey guys, I'm your host Dylan, and today I'm not trying to insult anyone's beliefs, culture, religion, or general identity. I just want to see what the reputable data has to say about a question that I've had for years. And while doing this, I'll look at what the research, statistics, and testimonies have to say, while staying as unbiased as possible as I answer these questions. First, I'll look at what slavery actually is. It's a little more complicated than you think. Whether or not modern Muslim countries fit the bill. The history of slavery in the Muslim region. Then lastly, if they fit the bill, what might be the reasons for that. If I make any errors, don't be afraid to let me know in the comments below, and then I'll put any corrections in the pinned comment below. But before we dig into anything controversial, we need to get our definition straight. Because the word slavery isn't what you're imagining in your head with a race-based, hereditary chattel slavery that we in America usually think of. It is so much bigger than that. Modern slavery, according to international human rights, is really an umbrella term. It refers to any system where someone is controlled through threats, coercion, or violence. And importantly, where someone else exercises, quote, powers attached to the right of ownership. Slavery today, in the vast majority of cases, is not about chains and auctions. Most of the time, it's so much more subtle than that. And here's the shocking part. About 5/80ths, or 0.625% of the entire global human population is in slavery. Now that number doesn't sound big until you realize that that means 50 million people worldwide. And the sad truth is that number is likely much higher due to how difficult it is to accurately estimate modern slavery. Because, you know, it's a worldwide illegal crime. Some countries are far above that number. For example, in Russia, 1.3% of the population are slaves. In Saudi Arabia, it's 2.1%. In Eritrea, it's a concerning 9% of the population. And then in North Korea, unsurprisingly, has the highest amount at a jaw-dropping 10.5% of the population being in a form of modern slavery. And if I'm being honest, I think there's a case to be made that the North Korean state has ownership over everyone who lives in North Korea. So if this is the rethought definition of slavery, then a lot of what happens in countries suddenly become a lot more uncomfortable. Now, let's move to the modern world. Now, here's the main point of the video. Are Muslim majority countries allowing and participating in de facto modern slavery? The answer is, sadly, yes. However, it's not a uniquely Muslim issue. So let's learn about it. A basic look of modern slavery gives you some good and bad news. First, the total level of slavery across the world has never been as low as it is today. But for the bad news, there is a specific standout part of the world that sticks out like a sore thumb when it comes to slavery. And as can be seen on this map, it is the modern Middle East, with over 1% of the total Arab state populations being in a form of slavery. But those numbers are just from the 6 that we talked about earlier, not from the story that I gave about Qatar. So let's see how this potential human rights abuses go down in these states. Starting with Qatar, the number I'm about to say feels unreal. 89% of the population are not citizens. To put that in perspective, in an American context, that'd be like if 300 million people living in the US were not citizens. And those 300 million were doing all the work that kept the country running. Qatar and virtually every nearby Arab state other than Yemen, who is currently going through a terrible civil war, has a system called the Kafala system. The Kafala system is unique around the world due to how it ties a worker's legal status, visa, and importantly, ability to leave the country directly to their employer. Employers get full control over passport confiscation, the ability to switch jobs, where workers can live, and in some cases, even needing permission to leave the country. The whole structure creates a system where exploitation is literally the purpose. And once your employer owns your documents, your jobs, and your right to even exist and go back to your country, well, it doesn't take a historian to recognize the eerie similarities between humanity's gravest sin. One Kenyan woman who migrated to Saudi Arabia through their version of the Kafala system recounted that for 2 years, she was forced to work without a single day off and was rarely allowed to leave the employer's house. The contract she signed promised an 8-hour workday and a weekly day off, but the reality was complete isolation, 12-hour workdays, 7 days a week. And worse for the definition of slavery, some domestic workers interviewed by human rights organizations expressed that they felt like they were literally being bought and sold by recruitment agents or new employers when their contracts were transferred, underscoring the dehumanization inherent in the system that looks a lot like the auctions we read about in history class. So that modern number for slavery in the Arab states, due to the Kafala system, might be a little low for what's actually happening. But what about hereditary servitude that I had mentioned in the intro? Was that one weird family that I heard this little anecdote from? Or is it a real common thread in Muslim majority countries? Well, for the most horrific example, we look no further than Mauritania, which has had the terrible record of being the last country on earth to legally outlaw and abolish slavery in 1981. The same year that Ronald Reagan took the American presidency, there was still a country where slavery was legal. But even worse, they didn't criminalize the practice until a few months before the Obama presidency started in 2007. And despite these improvements, descendant-based, hereditary, chattel-based slavery remains incredibly prevalent in the country. The society is dominated by the majority Bedouin, who control the administrative, judicial, and military apparatus, and maintain servitude over the black Mauritanians of slave descent, who constitute approximately 40% of the population. Mauritanians are treated as property by their masters, forced to work without pay in agriculture and domestic work jobs, and are subject to being inherited, loaned, and gifted in marriage, meeting the legal definition for slavery under the International Convention, but are not fully counted in the estimates of slavery due to the weak state and international access in Mauritania. And as to not have these servants rebel, their masters repeatedly tell them that their paradise is bound to their masters and that obedience guarantees them entry to heaven. Quite cruel. The Mauritanian government consistently denies any existence of slavery in the country and failed time and time again to implement any of the human rights reforms that would decrease slavery in the country. One of the reasons is because in the current judicial system, the burden of proof for slavery is put onto the victim of slavery themselves, who are usually illiterate and lack the resources to navigate the system, effectively preventing prosecution. It's like a worse version of the post-Civil War South. And while it's the worst in Mauritania, other Muslim-majority countries in the region like Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria aren't free from the issue either, as their countries have condemned chattel slavery and human trafficking, but lack any legislation specifically condemning hereditary servitude. This leads to many families keeping their servants from before the slavery abolition in these countries, almost like a grandfathered addition. But we need to figure out whether or not this is an issue that we can blame on Islam or some other factor. Maybe it's just the weak states in the region. And there's no better way to look at this than to look at the history of Islam in the Middle East. We'll start at the Rashidun Caliphate. Right after Muhammad's death, the first 4 caliphs expanded rapidly, and with that massive expansion came a huge influx of slaves. You had war captives, they could be enslaved. Civilians of conquered territory, often enslaved too. Tribute from defeated peoples, often included human slaves. And these practices were justified through classic Islamic law, which stated that captured non-Muslim combatants could be enslaved, civilians couldn't be killed, but they could be taken as spoils of war, and lands outside of Muslim rule, Dar al-Harb, were legitimate sources of slaves. There were limits, of course, with Caliph Umar freeing all Arab prisoners of war and in stating that Muslim Arabs could not enslave other Muslim Arabs. This decision sent a simple message: don't enslave your group, but do enslave the others. This idea shaped thousands of years of policy. Now, slavery's expansion really picked up with the Umayyad Caliphate. As you can see on your screen right here, the imperial expansion difference between the Rashidun Caliphate and the Umayyad was insane. The Rashiduns went from basically all of Arabia to including the western parts of India all the way over to the southern bits of France. And with these conquests, the supply of slaves increased immensely. And a great example of this is from Muhammad bin Qasim and his conquests and raids into 8th century India. Through one of these raids, tens of thousands were captured and brought to market as slaves. This demand was fueled on by the ruling urban class, because as the Muslim rulers became more urbanized, moving away from the traditional Bedouin lifestyle to the more luxurious, easier court life of an empire, the institution of slavery had to be increased so that work was still done, because these economies were not set up for a free labor capitalist market. At least not economy-wide. There were still sectors where capitalism thrived. And in case there was any doubt that the state did not sponsor slavery during this time period, look no further than the Bakht. It was a treaty between a Muslim governor of Egypt and the Kingdom of Numidia. Numidia got to trade with the Muslim Empire and got a guarantee of independence, and in return, they had to send 360 people annually as slaves to Egypt. If that's not endorsing slavery, I don't know what it is. And focusing more on Egypt, this was an area where the system of slave warriors began to grow in the Muslim world, where slaves were brought in from other areas across the world to just be trained to protect the empire. And while we're on this topic, it's a good time to bring up the differences in the European style of slavery we're so familiar with and the Muslim style of slavery. The difference being the easier ways of gaining freedom. If you were a high achiever, rising up the ranks in the military or the administration, you were usually given your freedom, and then any descendants you had afterwards were free. If your father was a free man, say a master had a kid with one of his slaves, that child would be free. Totally an opposite to what was common in America, where if a master had a kid with a slave, the child was going to be a slave. And then thirdly, you could start a successful slave rebellion like the Mamluks did. The Mamluks were a Circassian slave warrior class within side of Egypt who overthrew their masters and started their own empire, which, interestingly enough, started bringing in other people as slaves to do what the Mamluks used to do. And then we move over to the Abbasid Caliphate, and slavery here expanded to such a level that wouldn't be seen for another 500 years when the Europeans started colonizing the New World. For instance, after one man's raids, Mahmud of Ghazni, from 1018 to 1019, he returned with 253,000 Indian slaves. That would be the equivalent of roughly 5 million people going into a market as slaves in today's population numbers. The influx was so great that it completely crashed the slave economic market, making slaves virtually worth nothing on the market for a short period. But we have to step back, because with a system this large inside of an empire, there had to be some pushback. And there was during the most famous slave rebellion during all of the Islamic times. From 869 to 883, the rebellion was centered in the Mesopotamia area, where large numbers of enslaved black Africans, who were in a chattel slavery system different from domestic servitude or anything like that, who were deployed in harsh conditions, draining salt marshes, and establishing vast agricultural systems. And with the assistance of one upriser, Ali ibn Muhammad, the rebellion began to grow and grow. At first, it was only black enslaved Africans from the Mesopotamia region, but as the rebellion grew and it started defeating imperial armies, the rebellion began to include slaves of all backgrounds and even freedmen who were upset with the current slave system. And unlike most slave rebellions, which are quickly crushed, the rebellion was able to establish a political entity for 15 years, defeating multiple imperial armies until they were finally defeated in 1883. The Zanj rebellion was so impactful on the empire's economy, with huge devastation to the agricultural lands, irrigation systems, and the huge expenses that come with a 14-year military campaign. With all of this, the Zanj rebellion started the eventual collapse and fragmentation of the caliphate as Islam's central political authority. and a huge reason for the future collapse of a unified Muslim state. And modern scholarship categorizes this event, the Zanj Rebellion, as one of the bloodiest in medieval Western Asian history. But let's look at the empire that took over the caliphate's place soon after its collapse. That's the Ottomans. From about 1400 all the way until the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was the preeminent Muslim empire throughout the Middle East. And with them, they brought the most complete form of a system for slave armies, the Janissaries. The Janissaries were elite infantry taken through the Devshirme system, the infamous blood tax of the Ottoman Empire. How it worked is that Christian boys from the Balkans were taken from their families, converted to Islam, educated in Sharia law, trained rigorously throughout their childhood and adult years, and sole purpose was to be a loyal political and military force for the Sultan. They had no tribal ties, no local connections, and no family they could go back to. They served the state alone. Truly despotic, I would like to add. And the idea here is that if the Sultan didn't have to rely on nobles and powerful people throughout the empire in order to field armies, then he could have a much bigger say in what went down throughout his territories. And another thing the Ottomans perfected that was a common thread throughout Islamic empire history was concubinage. Concubines are basically an intimate relationship between a Muslim man and an enslaved woman. At least in this case. They don't necessarily have to be Muslim, but in this case they are Muslim. This was a legally permissible practice and was widespread among the Umayyad, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, the Mughals, basically every Islamic empire. This system was incredibly important to how the empire worked and how its succession plans worked after a ruler's death. In the Abbasid and later Ottoman courts, it was expected that the future sultan was going to come from the children of a concubine. The prevalence of this practice stemmed from the political advantage it gave. By relying on concubines, rulers could acquire legitimate, free heirs whose mothers were structurally isolated from outside political forces and really only had connection and safety because of their relation to the Sultan, unlike those who were born from marriages to free princesses. But not all of Muslim history was about expanding slavery. There were abolition efforts. It was never a widespread movement until the modern era when the entire world turned against slavery, but there were some rulers that were ahead of their time in trying to end it. In the 11th century, you had the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. Caliph al-Hakim abolished slavery in 1013, freeing all male and female slaves in his territories. Sadly, this did not last very long, and soon after his death, the Fatimids, in general, greatly expanded slavery. In the 13th century, you had the Mali Empire. Emperor Sundiata Keyti abolished slavery in 1235, proclaiming a person will never again be sold in this country. This did not last, with Mali being one of, if not the greatest source of slaves for the European Atlantic slave trade. In the 17th century, we had the state of Bone in Indonesia. The Sultan prohibited pre-Islamic practices and emancipated slaves from his reign in 1631 to 1644. Sadly, this did not last, and after his death, things quickly went back to the status quo and got much worse as the Dutch got more and more involved in the region. So it's clear from both history and modern contexts that Muslim countries practice a high level of slavery. And from what the data says, largely higher than average compared to the rest of the world. But Europe and Asia also had high levels of slavery in the past, but is virtually gone in the modern day. And while slavery in the Islamic world has never been as low as it is today, the numbers in the region are still much higher than any other region in the world. So the question is, why are these societies hanging on so much? Well, the most common argument that scholars make is the unchanging culture of Muslim countries. Now, this does sound offensive. If I said this in public, I might get slapped in the face. But this is both something that scholars and Muslim apologists have compared to Christianity, is that Islam is basically the same religion that it was 1,000 years ago. Like I was saying, this is a huge claim that Muslim apologists make themselves, speaking of the truth of their faith based on how unchanging it has been. However, what comes along with this is that if Europe continued their culture from 1,000 years ago, there would still be witch burnings, heretics would be up for execution, and homosexuals would still be stoned. All of which the modern West and most of the world considers backwards, but are still things that are common in Muslim countries. If you ever hear about anyone getting stoned in the world, there's a 99% chance that it comes from a Muslim majority area. The scholarship traces this divergence to a few events, roughly around 1000 CE. Unlike Western societies, which underwent a successful process of secularization, separating the civil systems from the religious systems, Islamic jurisprudence is viewed by many adherents as possessing eternal validity, serving as the absolute norm to which all humans must conform to. This alleged constancy of the law is functionally maintained by the dominance of Talid over, sorry when I butcher this, Lityad. We'll see on Google Translate how close I got that. Even though contemporary scholars argue against the historical closing of the gate of independent legal thought, the institutional power structure often enforces adherence to legal rulings and consensus established in the post-classical era. Finally, the effect of this functional legal status is most visible in the retention of pre-modern penal codes. Several Muslim-majority districts continue to codify or intermittently apply for severe moral and religious crimes. This includes stoning for adultery. This is based on the Hadith, but is fairly rare due to strict evidentiary barriers. The death penalty for apostasy or abandoning Islam, most famously in the blasphemy laws in Indonesia. However, they have blasphemy for like 5 different accepted religions, so they're complicated over there. And capital punishment for homosexuality. The continued legal sanctioning of these penalties highlights the irreconcilable difference between traditional Islamic law and modern international standards, underscoring the gap between medieval legal precedents and the modern legal precedents. Islam obviously didn't have to follow this path, because around the 7th to the 13th century, there was a massive debate in Islam on whether to focus entirely on theology, because God can change anything at will, versus balancing theology with studying the world, because by understanding the world, you can better understand God. Christian societies, largely due to having the separation of church and state, opted for the latter option. But they actually copied the Muslim world, because Islam from the 800s to the 1300s was on the cutting edge of all things scientific and discovery-based during the Islamic Golden Age. The Islamic world was a leader in scientific thought, philosophy, due to the importance of the school of thought of Kafala. It's basically a combination of classical Islamic thought and Greek philosophy. A summary of the advances include algebra, adoption and popularization of Hindu-Arabic numerals, and zero, importantly, establishment of trigonometry, the development of decimal fractions, the development of systematic pharmacology, the establishment of modern hospitals, the clinical distinction of smallpox and measles, the establishment of advanced observatories, the creation of detailed maps and cartography, the development of advanced water waste management systems, the beginnings of creations of automated technology and clocks, and so much more. Truly, this was a crazy time of discoveries. And to cap it off, Ibn al-Haytham has been described by scholars and historians as the world's first true scientist, and one of the most important figures in the discovery of the scientific method. During this time, it probably seemed like this era of Islam was going to last forever. But then something that happens only every 2,000 to 3,000 years hit the Islamic world in a terrible way. And most of Asia for that matter. A nomadic conquest. And the spread of one of the deadliest plagues of all time. But we're going to focus on the Mongol conquests, because they were more violent and brutal than you ever could imagine. And the more you learn, the more disturbing they become. Because during the rule of the first Khan, Genghis, death tolls are estimated to be around 40 million people, with the world population at that time being around 400 million. In case you didn't figure out what that meant that about 1 in every 10 people on Earth was killed because of him and the Mongols. That'd be like if one person was the cause of 800 million deaths in this world. Worse than many predictions of limited nuclear war. Some regions were hit harder. Northern China was said to have lost around 15 to 20 million people, almost completely depopulating the area. And in one of the craziest stories of all time, the killing of a Mongolian diplomat by the empire, which was around the Persian area, angered Genghis and the rest of the Mongols so much that they murdered almost the entire area with ancient estimates saying around 90% of the population was wiped out. Some sources claim that when the Khan went into the area, he told each of the 20,000 soldiers that they had a death quota of 24. All these numbers are highly disputed, by the way, so don't take them as fact. Importantly, for Muslim history, we have the Siege of Baghdad, where Genghis Khan's grandson had sieged the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and the cultural heartstone of the Islamic Empire, and then systematically wiped out nearly the entire city, killing between 800,000 to 2 million people. The Caliph himself was executed, wrapped in a rug and trampled by horses, to avoid shedding royal blood on the ground. An interesting Mongolian custom. And then the destruction of the Baghdad House of Wisdom was so great that ancient sources said that the amount of books being thrown into the Tigris River turned the river black. And then the descendants of the Mongols weren't done, because in the 1300s, a descendant named Timur the Lame killed a hilariously small 17 million people, nothing like his great-grandfather Genghis Khan. But he did decide to focus both his conquests on the Hindu Indians and the Muslim Turks, with Timur kidnapping the Ottoman Sultan in one of his conquests into the areas in order to raise loot and slaves. We know that the Sultan died in captivity, but there are disputed sources that claims that the Sultan was in an iron cage as he watched his wife being served by Timur. Other than this being another excuse for me to talk about history, these events were instrumental in the breaking of faith of Muslim rulers and lay people alike. The faith that they had in the natural world, because that natural world had just destroyed everything they loved and could love. During this time of depression, hopelessness, and anger, they turned fully to their God. Because if God could just let something like this happen, the favor of God was way more important than anything that could be studied about the world. And because of this, historian S.P. Scott wrote, "The relentless tide of the Mongol invaders drowned the last remnants of Arabic splendor and civilization. The destruction of Baghdad was not merely a political catastrophe, but a spiritual annihilation. This event caused such despair and cultural trauma that the vibrant spirit of inquiry was replaced by an unyielding fatalism and a rigid adherence to dogma. This kept Islam in a very conservative place for centuries, and anyone who tried to reform any part of the religion was either called a heretic or accused of drifting people away from God. And so any calls for reforms during the time of the Ottoman Empire were crushed, with the reasons given earlier being used, but also in addition providing stability for the empire, because any sort of reformation, if you want to look at Europe, can cause a little bit of political mayhem. However, many scholars believe that as the Muslim world begins to industrialize more and more, while also having the major social upheaval of authoritarian rule, not being able to supply for the population growth, extremist Muslim groups like ISIS, a reformation in Islamic culture could be on its way. In this case, the way that Christianity was practiced and thought, and not the secularization that happened after the 18th century. Hopefully, if a reformation like this can happen, then the current leftovers of harsh Islamic law could be doled out and removed, and with it, the problematic stances of human rights that it brings to the table. But only time will tell if anything like that could happen, and trying to be any more confident than just maybe is just lying on my part. Slavery in the Muslim world was not a footnote. It was a core institution for over a millennium, justified through religion. And in the modern day, when most of the world has moved beyond slavery, several Muslim majority areas still show some of the biggest rates among modern countries, while the legitimacy and potential slavery of the Kafala system is debated. These truths are rooted in historical institutions, legal frameworks, cultural continuity, intellectual stagnation formed by one of the greatest catastrophes in all of human history, and so many things that went wrong between the 13th and 14th century. Understanding all of this doesn't excuse it, but it does explain the reasons for its persistence. But it's ultimately up to you whether or not you blame the higher prevalence of slavery in the Muslim world on religion, something else, or a bit of a combination. And while Islam has been a very conservative and consistent religion for the last 1,000 years, extremist sects have used the religion in an increased way over the last few decades, and that's through terrorism. But wait, is that even true? Most people here in the West just believe it without actually looking into the research. And guess what? It's not that simple. You can figure out the answer to that question right here. And don't forget to judge Muslims as individuals, call for the end of the Kafala system, and think controversy. I'll catch you over in this video right here. Thanks so much for watching this long video.